In this video, I'll show you how to paper piece this block with these long skinny triangles. The finished size for this pattern is a 3-inch square, but you can use this same technique to make different size blocks like this one seen here. To get started, you'll need to download this paper piecing pattern at learnhowtoquilt.com under Beginner Basics, Paper Piecing, or you can find it in our pattern section. I've cut my pattern out around the dashed lines. It doesn't have to be perfect, just make sure you can see those dashed lines all the way around your pattern. These solid lines are my sew lines. The numbers on my pattern show the order in which to sew my fabric. When paper piecing, your fabric always goes on the back of the pattern. You also want to make sure when you begin this project that your fabric has been pressed. I like to take an old postcard or card and fold the lines between 1 and 2. Every time I fold this paper, the fibers are weakened. Later on, this will make it easier to pull off the paper. I also find this helps with fabric positioning and trimming the seams. I can fold these lines as I sew, or I actually find it easier to get them all done at once before I start my project. I'll be following these guidelines as I paper piece. You can download a copy at learnhowtoquilt.com under Beginner Basics, Paper Piecing. Here's my first fabric that I've pressed with a hot, dry iron. It has to be big enough to cover the number 1 piece, and I can see this more than enough covers that. So I like to cut it down into a smaller size. When I'm piecing triangles, I usually like to use rectangles. You can see that this piece of fabric will cover that number 1 spot, along with this 1/4 inch seam allowance. Since I'll be using this fabric 3 times in number 1, 3, and 5, I like to cut a long strip of fabric and then cut them down like I did these. But it's not necessary. I'll place fabric number 1 on the back of my pattern. My finger on number 1, turn it over, goes with the right side up, wrong side down. I'll pin that in place. Turn it over. I can take this and hold it up to a light source to see that shadow in the back of the fabric, but I can pretty well see just by looking at this that the fabric more than enough covers this point up here. On triangles, this is really tricky, so make sure that on each one of these you've covered this area up to the seam allowance, that you've covered this corner here and this corner here. Now I'm ready to trim. Fold this down. Take my scissors, and I'm going to eyeball about 1/8 of an inch seam. It's not really necessary to trim, but I like to do this because it helps with fabric placement, and when you have these long skinny points, that seam gets very bulky. That's why I'm saying to trim down to 1/8 of an inch. It just makes it easier. Now I'm ready for fabric number 2. Fabric number 2, and I've cut it more than enough to cover number 2 along with the seam allowance up here. I also want to get it to this line here. Put my finger here, turn it over. Fabric number 2 will go in this spot. I have to sew these two together. So in order to sew, I put right sides together. This piece can't be moved because it's pinned down, so let me put right sides together. Turn it over. I could take this to the sewing machine and sew this line, but I like to check to see if my piece will cover where it belongs. So I like to pin base that line. And now let's turn it over and let me see. If I turn this back, if I move that back like that, will fabric number 2 cover that whole spot after it's been sewn? And I see that it covers all the way up to the top, all the way to this corner, and down at the bottom. So I'm ready to take this to the sewing machine. To sew, I'm using red thread so you can see better. Usually I'm using a neutral color thread. A larger needle will help you perforate your patterns to make it easier to tear off the paper later on, but it's not necessary. I use a shorter stitch length on my machine when the pieces are tiny. I need to sew beyond this corner here on this pattern. Ahead of time, I've taken a ruler and I've drawn this line. Sometimes I just sew on the fold line. In the case of these points, I want to make sure that that line is perfect. So I just took a ruler alongside of the black line and marked that. I did that for each one of these points. When I sew, I want to make sure that I start past this dash line and sew all the way down past this dash line. Make sure I remove my pin. You want to stay on that black line. When I come to this point, I want to make sure that I sew all the way through. When I finish, I always clip these threads because they have a tendency to get caught up all over the place. So clip them now to avoid headaches later on. Turn that back. I have piece number 1 and piece number 2. I'll take this over to my iron to be pressed. And now I'm ready to go on to the next step. Fold the line between fabric number 2 and 3. I already did that earlier, so let me fold it down. And I repeat from 5 above, which says fold it and trim. I want to trim about 1/8 of an inch away from the seam. Now I'm ready for my piece number 3. Here's my fabric. It more than enough covers that triangle and seam allowance. Let me flip it over. Fabric number 3 will go right here. When I sew, I put right sides together and I'll pin that just to make sure that I've got everything lined up properly. Fold this back, and if I can hold it up to a light, or in this case I can see, here's number 3. I want to cover up at the top. I want to cover down at the bottom, so it's perfect. Turn this over, flip it back, and take it over to my sewing machine. Notice how I'm holding this up on the top. I don't like to pin there, but if you're having problems that this is coming down like this and it's not working out, then you might want to put a pin. Let me show you where you put the pin. You might want to put a pin in right here, and you also might want to put another pin in. I'll just take that one out at the back here. So you can see that that's pinned down, so you won't have problems with that getting caught up in your sewing machine. When I sew this, I could draw a straight line here just like I did with these slanted lines, but I can see my crease line there. I'll come in past the dash lines and just sew forward. Pin out. Sew all the way past that dash line. Ready to take this out. Let's turn this over, and I'll need to take this over to the iron to press that line. My piece has been pressed, and now I'm ready for number 4. First thing I need to do is fold that line between 3 and 4 and then trim. Here's fabric number 4. It's big enough to cover that triangle plus the seam allowance above and below. Flip this back. Fabric number 4 will go right here. Need to put right sides together. I can check it with a pin to make sure that it's going to work, and then come over and sew. I'll repeat this process with the next 3 pieces. After it's been pressed, trim. Fabric number 5 will cover this spot. Turn it over. Fabric number 5 goes here. Let's flip that over, pin base it, take it to the sewing machine, take this over to the iron and press. After pressing, I'm ready to trim. Fold this back, eyeball that 1/8 inch seam. Number 6, that more than enough covers. Fabric number 6 goes here. Put right sides together. Fold it back and press. After my block has been pressed, I'm ready to trim. I can trim this with my scissors, but I prefer to use my rotary cutter. You want to cut a 3-inch square around these dashed lines. Here's my completed block. If I want to use this for a card, I usually leave the paper inside. If I'm going to sew this into a small quilt, then I need to tear the paper off. And to tear that paper off, you just gently tug at it. You might need to use tweezers to get into these points. For more information about paper piecing, visit learnhowtoquilt.com under Beginner Basics Paper Piecing.